June 6, 1944, 6:30 a.m., Omaha Beach, Normandy. Major General Clarence Hubner stood in the command post 3 miles offshore, watching through binoculars as the first wave disintegrated. Bodies floated in the surf. Burning landing craft listed in the shallows. Machine gun fire raked the beach in overlapping arcs, creating kill zones where no man could advance. The entire invasion, 18 months in planning, was collapsing in real time. Hubner reached for the radio to request naval gunfire when a young signals officer grabbed his arm and pointed seaward. 800 yards offshore, rising from the water like iron fortresses, came the solution to a problem everyone had declared unsolvable. The DD tanks were working. Donald Duck tanks, duplex drive tanks, swimming tanks. The British press had mocked them. American armored commanders had rejected them. Eisenhower's staff had called them a waste of resources. But there they were, 30-ton Sherman tanks driving through 6-foot swells, their canvas flotation screens keeping them buoyant, their dual propellers driving them toward the beach at 6 knots. Behind the canvas shrouds sat 5 men who had no business being alive in open water, operating a machine that violated every principle of armored warfare. And they were about to save the invasion. The man who designed them had been laughed out of a War Office meeting in 1941. Major Percy Hobart, 55 years old, was recalled from retirement and given command of Britain's 79th Armored Division specifically because his ideas were too radical for conventional thinking. When Hobart proposed a tank that could swim, senior officers questioned his mental state. When he demonstrated a prototype, they called it a carnival trick. When he insisted it could land ahead of infantry and suppress beach defenses, they filed his proposal under impractical concepts and forgot about it. Until someone realized that without swimming tanks, the invasion of Europe was impossible. The story begins not on D-Day, but 3 years earlier in the catastrophic failure at Dieppe. August 19, 1942, Operation Jubilee. 5,000 Canadian troops, mostly from the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, launched a raid on the German-occupied French port. The plan called for Churchill tanks to land with the first wave, provide armored support, and suppress German defensive positions. The plan collapsed within minutes of hitting the beach. The Churchill tanks, weighing 40 tons, landed from tank landing craft at the waterline. German anti-tank guns positioned in concrete bunkers on the heights above the beach had clear fields of fire. The tanks that made it ashore bogged down in the shingle, their tracks spinning uselessly on the smooth stones. Those that achieved mobility were destroyed within seconds by German 88mm guns firing from hardened positions. Of the 29 tanks that landed, not one penetrated beyond the seawall. The infantry, pinned down without armored support, was slaughtered. By noon, the raid was over. 3,623 of the 6,086 men who landed were killed, wounded, or captured. The tanks sat abandoned on the beach, silent monuments to the failure. The lesson was brutal and undeniable. Landing tanks at the waterline under fire was suicide. German defensive doctrine anticipated amphibious assaults. Their beach fortifications, refined through 3 years of preparation, created overlapping kill zones specifically designed to destroy landing craft before they could disgorge armor. Every major Atlantic wall position included anti-tank guns with clear lines of sight to likely landing points. The British Army faced an impossible problem. Tanks were essential for breaching beach defenses, but landing them conventionally guaranteed their destruction before they could engage. Percy Hobart had been thinking about this problem since 1940. A career tank officer who had commanded Britain's 1st Armored Division in Egypt, Hobart was a difficult, abrasive perfectionist who alienated superiors with his insistence that armored warfare required complete doctrinal revolution. In 1940, after clashing with senior commanders over tactical theory, he was retired from active service at age 55. The British Army, facing potential invasion and desperately short of experienced officers, had concluded that Hobart's ideas were more trouble than they were worth. Eisenhower personally intervened. In October 1941, the Prime Minister ordered Hobart recalled and given command of the 79th Armored Division with a specific mandate: develop specialized armor for amphibious operations. Hobart assembled a team of engineers, tankers, and naval architects with instructions to solve problems that conventional military thinking declared unsolvable. One of those problems was getting tanks ashore alive. The concept of a swimming tank wasn't new. The Soviets had experimented with light amphibious tanks in the 1930s, attaching flotation pontoons to T-37 and T-38 models. These worked after a fashion, but were limited to rivers and calm water. They couldn't handle ocean swells. They certainly couldn't carry the armor and firepower necessary for beach assault. Hobart needed something different: a full-weight battle tank capable of engaging German defenses that could launch from landing craft thousands of yards offshore and drive itself to the beach at 6 knots. The solution came from an unlikely source. Nicholas Straussler, a Hungarian-born engineer working for a small firm called Folland Aircraft, had been developing an amphibious car design using collapsible flotation screens and propeller drive. Straussler proposed adapting the concept to tanks. A waterproof canvas screen, raised around the tank's hull by inflatable tubes and metal struts, would provide sufficient flotation. Dual propellers driven by the tank's engine through a power takeoff would provide propulsion. The crew would navigate using a floating compass and dead reckoning, aiming for shore until the tank grounded, then dropping the screen and engaging targets as a conventional tank. When Straussler presented this to the War Office in early 1941, the reaction was immediate dismissal. Canvas screens couldn't possibly support 30 tons of tank. The propeller drive would be too slow. The crew would be blind, navigating through surf with no protection. The whole concept was absurd. Hobart disagreed. He saw the operational logic. If tanks could launch from landing craft 2,000 yards offshore, beyond the effective range of German anti-tank guns, and swim to the beach while German defenders concentrated fire on the landing craft carrying infantry, the tanks would arrive intact and ready to fight. The Germans wouldn't expect tanks in the first wave because tanks couldn't swim. The element of surprise, combined with armored firepower landing ahead of infantry, could shatter beach defenses before they could organize effective resistance. In June 1941, Hobart authorized the construction of a prototype. Straussler's firm modified a Tetrarch light tank, installing the flotation screen and propeller system. The first test, conducted on a Welsh lake, was successful. The tank floated. The propellers drove it forward at 4 knots. The screen collapsed properly, allowing the tank to operate normally once ashore. Hobart immediately ordered full-scale development using Valentine medium tanks, then Sherman tanks arriving under Lend-Lease. The engineering challenges were immense. The flotation screen had to support the tank's weight while remaining flexible enough to collapse quickly. Straussler used rubberized canvas bonded to a metal framework that folded down in sections when the crew activated compressed air release valves. The screen extended 6 feet above the tank's deck, creating a boat-shaped hull that displaced enough water to keep the tank afloat with 18 inches of freeboard. The propeller drive used the tank's main engine running through a power takeoff to the rear sprocket. 2 3-bladed propellers mounted on outriggers provided thrust and steering. The crew controlled direction by varying propeller speed using differential steering, the same principle that steered the tank on land. Maximum speed was 6 knots in calm water, dropping to 4 knots in moderate seas. Range was limited only by fuel, though practical considerations of crew endurance and navigation accuracy meant operational range was about 3 miles. The most terrifying aspect was crew exposure. Once afloat, the tank crew had no protection. The flotation screen was canvas, providing zero ballistic protection. If German artillery or aircraft engaged the swimming tanks before they reached shore, the crews would die with no chance of defense or escape. The driver navigated using a prismatic compass and heading indicator, steering by instinct through waves that obscured vision. The tank commander stood exposed in the turret, directing the driver while watching for obstacles and incoming fire. If the screen failed or the tank took on water, the crew had perhaps 30 seconds to evacuate before the tank sank like a stone in water too deep to survive. Testing continued through 1942 and into 1943. The technical problems were endless. Canvas screens ripped in high seas. Propeller shafts broke. Navigation proved nearly impossible in anything beyond 3-foot swells. The tank capsized when waves struck from the beam. Crews suffered hypothermia from the spray and exposure. The Valentine tanks initially used proved too unstable, rolling dangerously in moderate seas. When the Americans began supplying Sherman tanks under Lend-Lease, Hobart's engineers switched to the more stable platform. The Sherman DD tank, finalized in late 1943, represented the production version, a standard M4A4 Sherman with the 75mm gun modified with Straussler's flotation system. The canvas screen, 36 feet in circumference, was erected by 36 rubber tubes inflated by a CO2 bottle. The propellers, driven through the final drive, produced knots at maximum speed. Total weight afloat, 32 tons. Freeboard, 18 inches in calm water, significantly less in any sea state. Crew, 5 men operating a machine that could kill them in dozens of ways, none of which involved enemy fire. Armored commanders hated it. When Hobart demonstrated the DD tank to visiting U.S. officers in late 1943, their reaction ranged from skepticism to outright hostility. Armored doctrine, perfected through North African and Italian campaigns, emphasized mass, speed, and firepower. Swimming tanks violated every principle. They were slow, vulnerable, and tactically inflexible. If landing craft could deliver tanks directly to the beach while covering fire from naval guns, why waste resources on amphibious modifications? The answer came down to timing and surprise. Landing craft carrying conventional tanks approached the beach at 10 knots, clearly visible to German defenders, who engaged them at maximum range with anti-tank guns and artillery. The landing craft, lightly armored and unmaneuverable, were devastatingly vulnerable. Dieppe had proven this. DD tanks launched from 5,000 yards offshore, swimming toward the beach while landing craft carrying infantry diverted German fire, would arrive intact and begin engaging defenses while German gunners were still focused on the obvious threat. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army, remained unconvinced. At a planning conference in March 1944, Bradley argued that DD tanks were a British eccentricity unsuited to American operational doctrine. He preferred conventional landing craft delivering tanks directly to the beach under covering fire from naval guns. Montgomery, commanding British and Canadian forces, disagreed. The British and Canadians would use DD tanks extensively. The Americans could do as they pleased. Eisenhower intervened. As Supreme Commander, he ordered American forces to incorporate DD tanks into the assault plan, but left tactical decisions to ground commanders. The result was a compromise that would have fatal consequences. British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches would launch DD tanks from 5,000 yards, swimming to shore ahead of infantry. At Utah Beach, American forces would launch DD tanks close to shore, minimizing water transit. At Omaha Beach, Bradley's staff planned to launch some DD tanks close to shore from landing craft, while others would swim from a few thousand yards, depending on sea conditions. The officers commanding the DD tank battalions understood what they were being asked to do. Swimming a 30-ton tank through open ocean under potential enemy fire with 18 inches of freeboard and canvas screens providing the only flotation violated every instinct developed through armored training. But the tactical logic was undeniable. If they could reach the beach intact, if they could engage German defenses while infantry were still hundreds of yards offshore, they could shatter the defensive positions and create the breachhead necessary for follow-on forces. Training intensified through the spring of 1944. British and Canadian DD tank crews practiced in the Solent, the channel between the Isle of Wight and the British mainland. American crews trained in Slapton Sands in Devon. The exercises were brutal. Tanks launched in rough seas capsized and sank. Crews drowned when canvas screens collapsed or propeller drives failed. The men learned to recognize sea states that exceeded the DD tank's capabilities. They realized that anything above sea state 3 with waves exceeding 4 feet made swimming suicidal. They understood that the tank felt nothing like a tank when afloat, wallowing and rolling with every swell, responding to steering inputs with maddening delay. They also learned that when conditions were right, when seas were calm and visibility good, the DD tank worked exactly as designed. The tank floated. The propellers drove it forward at walking pace. The canvas screens collapsed in cascading folds. 30-ton Sherman tanks, dripping seawater, drove up the beach with 75mm guns traversing toward German positions. The German defenders, still focused on approaching landing craft carrying infantry, suddenly faced armored assault from an unexpected direction. The DD tanks engaged pillboxes and machine gun nests at point-blank range, high-explosive shells detonating against concrete bunkers. Infantry landing craft touched down minutes later to find suppressive fire had neutralized or disoriented the forward defenses. Of the 40 DD tanks launched at Gold Beach, 34 made it ashore intact. 6 were lost to rough seas, their crews mostly rescued by following landing craft. The 34 that reached the beach provided the armored punch that shattered German resistance in the critical first hour. Gold Beach became one of the most successful landings of D-Day, with troops advancing inland against weakened resistance. At Juno Beach, where Canadian forces landed, the story repeated. The 1st Hussards and Fort Garry Horse launched DD tanks from 4,000 yards. Rough seas capsized several tanks immediately. Others made it halfway before being swamped in heavy swells. But 21 tanks reached the beach swimming, arriving ahead of the infantry landing craft. The Canadians encountered the heaviest resistance of any beach except Omaha, but the DD tanks engaging from the waterline suppressed German positions long enough for infantry to establish a foothold. By midday, Canadian forces had advanced further inland than any other Allied unit. At Sword Beach, where British 13th 18th Hussards launched 34 DD tanks, 28 reached shore. The pattern held. Tanks arriving ahead of infantry, engaging defenses while German gunners focused on the more obvious threat of landing craft, creating suppression that allowed infantry to advance from the beach. Casualties remained high, but the breakthrough occurred in minutes rather than hours as defensive positions fell to point-blank armored assault. Then there was Omaha. Omaha Beach represented the worst possible combination of terrain, defenses, and weather. The beach, dominated by 100-foot bluffs providing commanding fields of fire, was defended by the 352nd Infantry Division, a full-strength formation that Allied intelligence had failed to identify. German positions included 75 mortars, 18 anti-tank guns, 8 artillery pieces, and interlocking machine gun positions, creating kill zones covering every yard of beach. The surf was roughest at Omaha, with 6-foot swells and strong currents, and the American commanders made a fatal decision. At 0540 hours, 5,000 yards offshore, the USS Carroll and other landing ships prepared to launch DD tanks from the 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions. The company commanders, looking at the 6-foot swells, recognized immediately that conditions exceeded the DD tanks' operational limits. They radioed their concerns to the task force commander. The response came back: launch as planned. 29 DD tanks from the 741st Battalion entered the water. Within minutes, the first tanks began to swamp. The canvas screens, designed for 4-foot swells, couldn't handle the waves. Water poured over the top, flooding the hull. The propellers, undersized for the conditions, couldn't maintain headway against wind and current. Tanks wallowed beam to sea, rolling dangerously as waves struck from the side. Crew commanders watched their flotation screens collapse as water weight exceeded buoyancy. Then the tanks were sinking. 27 out of 29 DD tanks from the 741st Battalion sank before reaching shore. 135 men went into the water. Some escaped through turret hatches as the tanks went down. Many didn't. The tanks, flooding rapidly, descended to the bottom in 15 seconds. The men inside, trapped by the weight of equipment and the rush of water, drowned in darkness. The 2 tanks that reached shore did so only because their landing craft commanders, recognizing the disaster, ran their craft directly onto the beach and dropped the ramps at the waterline. The 743rd Tank Battalion, observing the catastrophe, made a different decision. Their battalion commander, seeing the sea conditions and the fate of the 741st, ordered landing craft to deliver the tanks directly to the beach. The landing craft, under heavy fire from German positions on the bluffs, ran onto the shore and dropped its ramps. Tanks drove off into 3 feet of water, immediately engaging German positions. But they arrived late, after the infantry had already landed and was pinned down by withering defensive fire. Omaha Beach became a slaughter. Without the armored support that DD tanks would have provided in the critical first minutes, infantry landing craft approached under fire from unengaged German positions. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery decimated the first waves. Men drowned in the surf, weighted down with equipment. Bodies piled up at the waterline. Burning landing craft blocked the approach lanes. For 2 hours, the invasion at Omaha Beach balanced on the edge of complete failure. The breakthrough came from individual initiative and desperate courage, not from tactical planning. Small groups of infantry, led by junior officers and NCOs, found paths through German minefields and wire. They assaulted pillboxes with demolition charges and rifles. Engineers cleared obstacles under fire. Destroyers ran dangerously close to shore, firing directly at German positions at point-blank range. By 0900 hours, elements of the 116th Infantry Regiment had secured exits from the beach. By noon, the breakthrough was established, but Omaha cost 2,400 casualties, nearly half the total D-Day losses, in exchange for the most tenuous foothold of any beach. Historians have debated endlessly what might have happened if the DD tanks had launched closer to shore at Omaha, as they did at Utah Beach, or if commanders had recognized that sea conditions exceeded operational limits and delivered tanks conventionally. The counterfactual haunts every analysis of D-Day. 27 tanks reaching shore intact and engaging German positions during the critical first minutes might have changed everything, or they might have been destroyed by German anti-tank guns the moment they landed, adding another disaster to an already catastrophic morning.
What's undeniable is that at 3 of 5 beaches, DD tanks worked exactly as Hobart and Straussler had designed them to work. They swam through rough seas, arrived ahead of infantry, engaged defenses while German gunners focused on more obvious threats, and provided the armored punch necessary to shatter defensive positions. The British and Canadian forces, using DD tanks extensively, achieved their objectives with dramatically lower casualties than American forces at Omaha, where DD tank failure left the infantry unsupported. The war continued for 11 more months after D-Day, but the invasion of Europe was successful because Allied forces established a foothold strong enough to survive German counterattacks and build up forces for the breakout. That foothold existed because specialized armor, including DD tanks, provided capabilities that conventional armored doctrine couldn't deliver. Hobart's funnies, as they were called, included not just DD tanks, but also flail tanks for clearing mines, bridge-laying tanks, flame-throwing tanks, and dozens of other specialized vehicles that solved specific problems the invasion presented. Percy Hobart never commanded troops in combat again after D-Day. His role was development and training, preparing specialized armor and the crews to operate it. But his contribution to Allied victory was incalculable. The swimming tank, mocked as impractical in 1941, became essential to the invasion of Europe. Without DD tanks, the British and Canadian landings would have resembled Omaha Beach, with infantry pinned down under withering fire, struggling to advance against intact defenses. With DD tanks, those beaches became breakthroughs, achieved in hours rather than days, with casualties measured in hundreds rather than thousands. The Americans learned the lesson. After D-Day, U.S. armored forces incorporated specialized vehicles into operational planning. DD tanks participated in the Rhine crossing in 1945, swimming the river to establish bridgeheads. The concept validated at Normandy informed American amphibious doctrine through the Korean War, Vietnam, and beyond. Modern amphibious assault vehicles trace their lineage directly to Hobart swimming tanks, using the same principles of waterborne approach followed by conventional ground combat. Nicholas Straussler, whose engineering made the DD tank possible, received little public recognition. His firm continued developing amphibious vehicles through the war, but the DD tank remained his most significant contribution. After the war, Straussler emigrated to South Africa, where he died in 1966, largely forgotten by military historians who focused on commanders and combat units rather than the engineers who made victory possible. The DD tanks themselves disappeared quickly after the war. The specialized equipment, expensive to maintain and limited in tactical application, was stripped from surviving Shermans. Most were scrapped. A handful survived in museums, monuments to an engineering solution that violated conventional thinking but worked when it mattered most. Today, a DD tank sits in the Imperial War Museum, its flotation screen raised, looking impossibly fragile for a machine designed to carry 5 men through ocean swells into combat. The crews who operated DD tanks rarely spoke about their experience. The terror of swimming a 30-ton tank through rough seas, with 18 inches of freeboard and canvas screens providing the only protection from drowning, wasn't something easily communicated to people who hadn't experienced it. The men knew they were operating machines that could kill them through mechanical failure, rough weather, or enemy action. They accepted the risk because the tactical necessity was undeniable and because professional soldiers do what's required regardless of personal fear. The fate of the 741st Tank Battalion at Omaha Beach haunted DD tank veterans for decades. 27 tanks lost. Crews drowned in their vehicles because commanders ordered them to launch in conditions that exceeded design limits. The decision to proceed, made 5 miles offshore while watching 6-foot swells, represented the calculation that Eisenhower and his staff faced constantly. Balance risk against necessity, accept casualties to achieve objectives, and live with the consequences of decisions made with incomplete information under impossible pressure. The DD tank's success at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches vindicated Hobart's vision. The disaster at Omaha demonstrated the narrow margins that separated brilliant innovation from catastrophic failure. Sea conditions, operational decisions, tactical doctrine, and pure chance all influenced outcomes. The same machine that saved British and Canadian forces drowned American tankers when launched in conditions it wasn't designed to handle. What's remarkable isn't that some DD tanks were lost, but that so many succeeded. Swimming a 30-ton tank through ocean swells violated common sense and conventional military doctrine. The engineering challenges were immense, the operational risks were obvious, the tactical advantages were theoretical until proven in combat. Yet Hobart, Strausler, and the crews who operated DD tanks took the concept from mockery to essential capability in 3 years, overcoming technical problems that experts had declared unsolvable. The death ray inventors, Tesla, Matthews, Shebold, and Ito, pursued weapons that physics rendered impossible. Hobart and Strausler pursued a weapon that physics rendered improbable but achievable with sufficient engineering. The difference was understanding limitations and working within them rather than attempting to circumvent fundamental laws. DD tanks didn't defeat the inverse square law or overcome energy dispersion. They solved a specific tactical problem using available technology applied creatively. The swimming tank worked because it accepted compromises. It was slow, vulnerable, and limited in range. It required specific sea conditions to operate safely. It needed crew courage that bordered on recklessness. But within those constraints, it delivered a capability that conventional armor couldn't provide, putting tanks on hostile beaches ahead of infantry, engaging defenses while German gunners focused on other threats, and creating the suppression necessary for infantry to establish a foothold. D-Day succeeded for many reasons. Air superiority prevented German reinforcement, naval gunfire suppressed coastal batteries, airborne operations secured flanks. Deception convinced the German high command that Normandy was a feint. But on 3 of 5 beaches, in the critical first hour when success or failure hung in balance, swimming tanks drove out of the surf and engaged German defenses, turning tactical theory into operational reality. Major General Hubner, watching from offshore as Omaha Beach dissolved into chaos, never saw DD tanks arrive because most had sunk miles from shore. But at Gold Beach, his British counterpart watched DD tanks drive up the beach and suppress defenses exactly as planned. The difference wasn't courage or training or tactical skill. The difference was a machine that worked, operated by crews willing to trust their lives to canvas screens and propeller drives because someone had been crazy enough to believe that tanks could swim. Percy Hobart died in 1957, long after the specialized armor he'd developed had been scrapped and forgotten. His obituaries focused on his difficult personality and his conflicts with senior officers. They mentioned his role in developing specialized armor, but treated it as a footnote to a controversial career. What they missed was that Hobart had solved one of the fundamental problems of amphibious warfare: how to get armor ashore intact, ready to fight ahead of infantry that needed its support. The solution was absurd on its face. Tanks don't swim. 30-ton armored vehicles powered by 400-horsepower engines have no business in open water. Canvas screens shouldn't support that weight. Propellers driven by tank transmissions shouldn't provide sufficient thrust. Crews shouldn't navigate by compass through 6-foot swells while German artillery searches for targets. None of it should have worked. But it did. For one morning in June 1944, on 3 beaches in Normandy, swimming tanks drove out of the surf and engaged German defenses, exactly as a rejected engineer had promised they would. The men who designed them, built them, and operated them had taken an idea that conventional military thinking dismissed as impractical and made it essential to the invasion of Europe. 79 years after D-Day, military analysts still study the invasion, parsing tactical decisions and operational outcomes. The DD tank appears in every analysis as a critical capability that influenced success on multiple beaches. The disaster at Omaha highlights the risks of operating at the edge of design limits. The success at Gold, Juno, and Sword demonstrates what happens when innovation, engineering, and courage converge. The rejected engineer who built the weapon that saved D-Day wasn't rejected for incompetence. Percy Hobart was too competent, too insistent, too convinced that conventional doctrine was insufficient for modern warfare. He challenged senior officers, questioned established thinking, and demanded resources for ideas that seemed absurd. He was pushed into retirement because difficult, brilliant people are easier to sideline than to integrate. Churchill brought him back because Britain needed difficult, brilliant people who solved impossible problems. The swimming tank was impossible until someone built it, tested it, refined it, and proved it worked. Then it became essential, deployed in the most critical operation of the war, trusted with the lives of thousands of men on 5 beaches where failure meant catastrophe. The weapon that saved D-Day wasn't a death ray or a superbomb or a miracle technology. It was a tank with canvas screens and propellers, operated by men who trusted engineering and courage more than conventional wisdom. It succeeded not because it defied physics, but because it worked within physical constraints to deliver a capability that nobody thought possible. The morning of June 6, 1944, proved Percy Hobart right. The swimming tanks drove up the beaches of Normandy exactly as he'd promised they would, 3 years after being laughed out of a War Office meeting. The invasion succeeded because someone had been stubborn enough to believe that impossible problems have engineering solutions, and because men were brave enough to swim 30-ton tanks through ocean swells into combat. That's not innovation, that's desperation refined into doctrine, impossible made inevitable through engineering, and conventional wisdom proven insufficient by men willing to trust their lives to canvas screens and British eccentricity. The death ray never worked, the swimming tank did. The difference was knowing what physics allowed and having the courage to pursue it despite the laughter.